Welcome back, YouTube. Another Tim Cain video here. When your game doesn't sell. As I told my Twitch chat, panic, panic, cry in a corner, and everything's on fire. You don't have enough money now. Oopsies. Let's see what Tim says, though. Maybe he's got some good advice.
Hi, everyone. It's me, Tim. Today I want to talk to you about what you should do when your game doesn't sell.
Panic.
We've all been there. Well, I've been there.
I've been there
I did
too.
a whole video, in fact, on data about my games, talking about their sales figures and how it doesn't always seem to correlate with critical reviews or team size or budget or any of that.
It doesn't, and in some cases, it also might not even be a reference to. Well, I think Tim kind of mentioned, but it's not necessarily a reference of how good or bad the game is. You can have a good game that sells horribly, and you can have a bad game that sells well. In a lot of cases, especially if you have a publisher, the responsibility of selling the game well lays on the publisher, not the developer. Now, of course, a better game, I think, will inevitably have a better chance at succeeding financially. But if a game doesn't succeed financially, usually people don't look at the developer and say, ugh, they made a bad game. It's like, oh, they had a publisher, they didn't do their job very well.
The video is linked below in the description. But I want to talk to those few of you who are going to make games and they're not going to sell very well. Now, I realize some of you aren't going to make games. That may be even be the majority of you. And then a few of you are going to make only games that sell remarkably well. This video is not for you unicorns. It's for developers like me and the rest of you who are going to make games that aren't going to sell well. And you're left thinking, what was that about?
Most developers, most games do not sell well. Most do not recuperate enough to fund long-term development. They don't recuperate enough to sustain a studio or a team of any significant size. This is especially true in indie games. There is a massive pool of indie games on Steam that will release within the next, I don't know, let's say week, let's just say. Like I mentioned on the previous video, there's probably 100 games that will release within the next 7 days on Steam. Likely around that number. Most of them you will never know about. You might know about one or two of them. Your game might be one of those 100. And I'm sorry to say, but in most cases, it will not recuperate enough money to be considered a financial success. Most games do not meet that standard, and it's a very hard standard to meet, especially as it becomes easier to make games and easier to release them. You will naturally just have a larger influx of games being made. Grok 3, at the time of making this, people are generating small games with Grok 3. Sorry to say, but guess what? That's going to flood the market with low-quality AI-generated games. You have to then compete with that as an indie developer. And it becomes harder and harder to market your game. It becomes more and more expensive, and the more money you spend on marketing the game, the more you have to recuperate the cost, and it isn't always going to be a linear or even positive payback. You may spend $1,000 on marketing and only make $500 back in sales. That's not really successful. So then you have to ally yourself with like a publisher or an indie publisher or a large publisher, whatever, just any publisher or any sort of agency that can help you piggyback on their success or on their name, but then you're selling off, your game to that publisher. A lot of people don't want that either. It's just selling games is probably just as hard as making the game, and they both need to succeed in order for your game to be successful. There's a lot of people that can make games out there, but there's not a lot of people that know how to sell them well, and that kind of sucks. But that's my warning to indie developers. Just because you can make a good game does not mean that you can actually make it financially successful. And it's great to make a good game. 100% great. But if you cannot sustain your development with it, then you won't be able to feed yourself, and therefore, that's not good for your health or for your life in any way. Just think about what you need and don't think that you can do it all alone, because you probably can't. You are not one of those unicorns in most cases. I'm not.
And I'm going to talk about it, but let me just warn you, there's going to be a lot of people who just wade in and say, yeah, you made a bad game, you should make a better one. Which, I've done a whole video about people who say games are bad, and it's linked below. And what they really mean is they didn't like it,
Yeah.
even though they may couch it
There's
as
no bad game. There's just a game that isn't meant for you. Just like there's no bad game design. There's just game design that doesn't work for this specific game at this specific time.
no, it was an objectively bad game, and watch me prove it. And I don't know what to say to these people, because I pointed out that there are games on Steam that some people liked, even though a lot of people didn't. There are a lot of games that many people love, but a few people have real strong objections to and don't like. So throw out all the whole idea of a bad game or a good one. And besides, those kind of things are completely unconstructive. I'm going to try to give you constructive ways of looking at a game you've made that didn't sell like you wanted to, and you want to improve going through the process the next time. So let's look at why games don't sell. I'm going to talk about reasons that have to do with the game, and then reasons that have nothing to do with the game itself.
Yeah.
And some of these you can control, and some you can't. And that depends on your situation. So let's talk about game reasons that a game didn't sell well.
Okay.
Probably the biggest one is it's buggy. And that's what reviewers will say and game players will say. It's buggy. Sometimes this is code bugs. It may crash. It may run really slow. There may be actual errors in the code. Now, running slow can also be from other reasons. And a real common one is an artist made a model that was too many polys or too big of textures, or a level designer threw so much stuff into a scene that the engine can't possibly keep up.
I think there's a different way to qualify bugs, though. And I think that I'm more lenient than a lot of players. So, for instance, if I'm playing like a new game and, I don't know, a couple of characters glitch inside of each other, I'm like, oh, and then I move on. It doesn't bother me because it's what I call a cosmetic bug, meaning that it's a bug that doesn't impact gameplay in any way. It doesn't prevent my progression. It's just something funny that happens, and I just move on from it, right? Now, it can impact immersion, and games that are highly immersive, I think that this can, or that bank on being highly immersive to be really fun. Like a game like The Last of Us or something. You're meant to kind of feel like you're in that world, or like Red Dead Redemption 2. So bugs like that might affect your immersion and could negatively impact the experience at some point. So in those games, they might be a little bit more highly rated in terms of problematic as other games that aren't as immersive. And then there are other bugs that are those progression blockers, those save game corruptors. Those are critical issues. Those absolutely need to be fixed, and those will impact not just my enjoyment of the game, but also how I feel about the game and its state in release. One or two crashes is not going to ruin me too much, especially in a game that probably saves often. Like for Avowed, it's crashed me like 4 times. I don't really give a shit because the game saves all the time, so it doesn't bother me. But a game that constantly crashes, or just, like No Man's Sky on release, which was just literally unplayable, or Cyberpunk on release, which was literally unplayable. These are games that are not, it's not that these are design issues, these are just games that run poorly, and I can't even give an objective view of the game's design and how it's, it plays from point to point, because I cannot get from point to point without experiencing bugs that detract from the experience.
That doesn't have to do with the programmers. It has to do with tools the programmer made that then other people
that too
abused.
Yeah.
I've talked about that with scripts, Arcanum scripts. I tried to make sure that you couldn't make a loop. People found a way of making a loop. In most of the modern engines, like Unreal, there are blueprints, and anybody can make a blueprint, and it can lead to literal bugs in the game.
Yep, it can.
But that's not a programmer doing that. But the programmers will get blamed. Sorry, programmers.
He's right
so
about that.
So in addition to bad code
true.
and bad scripts, a little more about scripts. You may see a lot of things in the game, like a creature doesn't spawn correctly, or an item doesn't show up where it's supposed to, or you go to turn in a quest and the game doesn't recognize you've completed the quest. Those are usually bad conditions in a script somewhere, and people will go, "Oh, that's super buggy." Yes, but that's not a programmer.
Yeah, it's like it could be a quest designer.
That's usually conditions in a script somewhere that a non-programmer put in.
Yep.
And then finally, there can be design flaws that look like bugs, but really, the programmer and the scripters and the artists and everything did exactly what the design document said, and there's a problem in the game. I've done that.
Me too.
Arcanum had numerous flaws that were in the base design document. So everything was made exactly the way it was written in the design document, especially the places I wrote in the design document. But the problem, the bugs in the game were in the design, not the implementation of the design. So those are all the ways the games can be buggy. But there are some other reasons a game cannot sell well that have to do with the game that have nothing to do with the implementation per se. And that's, I'll categorize all that as niche. You may make a game with a setting that just doesn't have broad appeal. There's not a lot of people out there interested in playing a, multi-dimensional being that likes to clean houses.
This is true, and I think appeal is one of the things that separates a lot of indie developers from becoming, going into the professional scene. Not only is a choice to not make games with broader appeal, which is okay, but also sometimes designers, it's usually designers, struggle to design games that have enough appeal to make back the money that is being invested in, and of course making a profit from that too, because it's a business, you got to make profit to survive. So it's like there's a lot of great indie games that have really cool ideas that do appeal to some people. But then they spent like $100,000 on development, but there's no way they could recuperate that even if they marketed it reasonably well, just because their idea was cool to a very small amount of people that would never be able to help recuperate that initial investment. And, that's just kind of how it is. That's again why you might say, okay, you've made a really cool 2D platformer. The problem is that it's a very saturated market, or there isn't enough appeal for this genre. Let's just say, I don't know, like RTS games right now are not super high in popularity. They used to be way back in the day. Nowadays they aren't. So it's much more of a niche than, I think turn-based strategies are coming back in style, but RTSs are kind of, they're a very, very niche thing. And no matter what kind of idea you have for an RTS, your budget cannot exceed, in most cases, a certain amount, because there's just no way that the market for RTS games is going to exceed its current number, unless you make something that is so innovative and magical and amazing that you can bring people into the genre who weren't part of it before. But you can't bank on that. That is a rarity. Most publishers are not going to buy your game based on that premise, unless it is, again, like just something that they can kind of feel in their bones is going to be the next big thing.
Or you may make a story that just has limited appeal.
Yep.
People can't relate to the characters. Characters are a good example of, if you have characters that people find hard to relate to, it may make your game have a limited appeal.
You hear that, BioWare? Did you hear that, Tosh? Okay, we joke about Tosh, but generally speaking, yeah, appeal can also have that negative impact on the higher end, where once you have a budget over a certain amount, like you have with a lot of AAA games, the appeal needs to be so broad, because it's not like there's enough people that are playing a game that would play like Dragon Age Origins, right? Dragon Age Origins, if you made a game like that nowadays, I would argue you could definitely not have a $400 million budget. It just, people who want to play the real time with pausable combat, it's not that big. It really isn't. And so you can still make a game, but I wouldn't say that your budget could exceed over 50 million if you're even a big name studio. And for a lot of smaller studios, you probably can't exceed more than 5 million. So if you have a budget of 400 million, you need to broaden the appeal. You need to put in elements or gameplay that satisfies a larger market. So what you do, you make action RPG combat. I'm sure Avowed did the same thing. It's like, yeah, it's easily sellable. A lot of people will play action RPG combat. It's easy to balance in a lot of ways. You can make it easier or harder. So it just works. It's broad appeal. Bethesda does the same thing. They spend hundreds of millions of dollars on their RPGs. They make that broad appeal with their action RPG combat too. It works. But then of course you have the potential where if you make your game so broad in appeal, you now aren't actually really doing anything creative. You're not doing anything unique. It just feels like a really, really well produced, boring ass game. Just wrote Marching Cubes, Algo, and Shader. Oh wow, nice. Obligatory swords reference. Yeah, so it's like, making your game, you need to find the right amount of appeal, and by broadening your appeal, you can actually have your game sell worse. That's one of the reasons why I hesitate to add certain things to Cauldron Chronicles, is because I know that if I broaden the appeal too much, I'm actually diluting the appeal of the unique selling points that I have at the moment. And you don't want to do that. You don't want to dilute your selling points.
Make your game have a limited appeal. It's not bad, but that's why it's not selling well.
Mm-hmm.
Similarly with mechanics, you may decide to make an isometric game, and people think, sorry, that's over. You may make a turn-based game.
Yep.
People don't like those as much as real time. Or you may pick an art style that a lot of people are like, I don't really like that art style. It's not that it's bad. It's just that you've incredibly limited the scope of people who would be interested in your game in the first place, and then your sales are low.
Well, just as Tim says, every choice you make as a designer is going to limit your audience a little bit more, and you can try to find the ways that limit your audience with each decision at the least amount possible, but you usually, by doing that, need to make those broad appeal decisions. And by doing that too much, again, like we said before, you're actually limiting the appeal of your game, because your game now is not doing anything unique or interesting. So sometimes you need to make those decisions where you're like, okay, new From Software game, no, we're still not going to put in difficulty options. This is what we do. We make this. You learn to play it and you learn to beat it, or you shove off. I mean, that's a controversial one. I don't want to get into the whole thing about difficulty, but generally speaking, you make the game that you want to make. You realize that it's going to have an appeal to a certain audience, and every decision you make is going to limit that appeal a little bit more and more. Where you're going to make those sacrifices, we're going to say, okay, well, I thought I would make this more unique, but in reality, players don't like this. And you know what? In order to make sure that I'm not limiting the appeal too much, because 90% of players hate this system, I will walk back the system, or I will make it a bit more simplified so that I'm not cutting off my audience at something that doesn't really matter at the end of the day. But something that is core to it, like for us, alchemy combat is quite core. I don't want to add in martial combat because I think it would dilute the selling points of the alchemy combat. I'm not going to include it. And I'm willing to cut it off there and say, nope, this is what I stand by. And if people don't like it, they don't have to buy it.
So if you decide to go with something that's niche, understand that if this doesn't catch on, it's going to stay niche, and you're going to appeal to a very small number of people. So those, I think, are the two biggest reasons games don't sell well. They're either buggy, in all the different ways I said they could be buggy, or they're niche, so they just don't appeal. But there's a couple other reasons games cannot sell well that have nothing to do with the game itself.
Hold on. Two reasons are that it's buggy or that it's too niche. I don't know what the correct pronunciation for that is. One of us is right, or we could both be wrong. I disagree with Tim, or I don't think that he's wrong with what he said, but I think that there are more reasons. And I would say that the too broad of appeal is one of the reasons, but it is kind of only really started to happen in recent times. But I think that is not... Oh. You could say it's a symptom. It's not a cause. The cause is that the game has too high of a budget. It's as simple as that. And the symptom of that is that you need to recuperate costs. So how do you do that? You make the game safer and appeal to more people. And now you can't sell it because you've widened the appeal so much that you have nothing interesting to say, or that the game isn't actually anything unique. But to me, that is not a cause. The cause is the high budget. Too high of a budget.
The first one has to do with timing. When the game was released. Maybe the market was saturated with games, and it's just...
Yep.
There were so many games people could have bought that they bought other games besides yours, or that it diluted the market.
Well, look at February. Look at the month that we're in now. What we have had... What did we have released this month? We had Avowed. We had Monster Hunter Wilds. We had Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, and I think that I am missing something that released this month. Another big title. There are just a lot of games releasing, and it's hard enough to ask people from Western, highly developed countries that make a lot of money to spend, $180 or more in 1 month on games. it is way less likely that you're going to convince people from, less developed countries who don't make as much money to spend 180 equivalent dollars on games. When you release is incredibly important. You can make a great game, you can have the greatest marketing, and you cannot sell because you released right in the middle of two big games that were similar to yours, and people decided that they wanted to buy the first one because they didn't want to, have FOMO, and they were going to save their money then for the second one, or they were still playing the first game when your game released, and they're like, well, I'm just gonna wait maybe on a sale, or I'm gonna keep finishing up this first game, and then by the time I do that, well, this third game comes out, and I don't want to miss that one, and I just, it came in between a horrible period, and now they're buying your game when it was 20, 30 bucks on sale when it released for 60, and you aren't making enough money back because, again, poor release window. That's a lot of games delay themselves because of that, or you have games like Baldur's Gate 3 that released 1 month sooner, which they shouldn't have done, in my opinion, because of Starfield, and, just in order to not overlap with that release too much.
Sometimes games cannibalize on each other.
Yes, they do.
So a lot of games went out. Any one of those games would have sold well, but because there's 10 of them, they all sold It can also happen if it's a seasonal game. If you're putting out a holiday themed game in July or a beach game in the winter, it may not sell well just because people aren't in the mood for that style of game at that time.
That, horror games in January, or even games that release during Steam sales, where during a Steam sale, I think right now actually Steam Next Fest is going on, right? Let me pull up Steam. Steam Next Fest is going on now. This does not negatively impact the new and trending games, but there are some Steam sales that hide new and trending like way further down in the page. I don't have like an example right now because Steam Next Fest is not hiding, but let's assume that if you click on Steam Next Fest, this is what Steam would look like during a sale, right? Like, oh, it's the winter sale, search for winter themed games or whatever. And you don't see any of the new titles being released unless you scroll all the way down here. Most people aren't going to do that. So releasing during a sale is also quite nasty. The good thing is Steam announces when their sale dates will be, so you can prepare for it pretty ahead of time. BG3 had nothing to worry about with Starfield. I don't think they did either, but I can understand why they wanted to release sooner. I also think that they kind of shot themselves in the foot by releasing sooner because the game was pretty buggy on release. It had a lot of issues, especially in the third act, which, in good news for them, most people will not reach the third act, within like 2 weeks of the game releasing. Unfortunately for them, I did reach the third act within a couple of weeks. Yeah, you still haven't, so it's like, for me, my first experience with that game was soured because the third act was incredibly buggy, and in my opinion, wasn't as good as the first two acts. But either way, I can't relive that magic. I can't undo my memories of that game and experience it when it wasn't as buggy and had issues. So, it's just kind of the way it is. It sucks, but that's the choice that they made.
Time. And then another timing issue that happens frequently is you put out a game, but a similar game came out to yours around the same time. Maybe it's 2 fantasy RPGs, or maybe it's 2 FPSs set in a very similar setting. And the other one did good and yours didn't. It's sometimes a similar game can just outperform yours. If you had come out a year earlier or a year later, your game would have done better.
Yep.
Timing. And then related to that is marketing. There's a whole bunch of ways marketing can fail to support a game. There can be too little marketing. There's very few ads, very few ways people are even made aware your game exists. The ads can be not very good. Either they don't look good, they don't attract anyone's attention, or they show your game in a way that isn't really what your game is about. So
yeah, the mismarketing. I've been there. We mentioned before. I worked in like a very light train sim. It was more inspired by Euro Truck Sim. That's kind of what I took it from. In fact, my 3 inspirations were, I think my main 3 were Euro Truck Simulator, a game on Android called Tiny Rails, I think it was called, and Open Transport Tycoon. Like these are not really hardcore simulator games. They're mixed with like light sim plus management in most cases, or they're entirely management games. That's how we felt we could be unique. That's how we felt we could make something positive. So what did the publisher and their marketing do? Ultra Realistic Simulator was on the Steam page. Complete ineptitude. Complete ineptitude. So yeah, mismarketing the game can just detract from sales, or it might, worst case too, it's not just detracting from sales, it will bring people to your game to buy it who expect something different. Rightly so. They were sold, they will feel like they were sold a different product than what they bought. And if they played over 2 hours, they can't refund it. They will write a negative review, which will impact your sales more. Marketing your game correctly has a massive impact on sales. And even beyond that, the way that you correct any of those mistakes. Maybe you wrote something bad, or maybe you said something in an interview that was not as well described as it should have been. You can correct that very easily if you're the type of person to stay on top of that. But if you're like a marketing team for a publisher, you have so many barriers of communication to get something out on Twitter that, or on YouTube, that maybe it takes 2 months or two, even at worst case like a couple weeks to get some information out that corrects that mistake. Well, that mistake has already been made. Sometimes it's too late to fix it. And the public, the developer can't do anything in some cases because they don't have access to control the marketing or to control the Steam page. In a lot of cases, when you sell your game to a publisher, they are the ones to control the Steam page. They're the ones to control the social media. In many cases, they're the ones to control the Discord. So you have no control over what gets said and how it gets said, or you have very little control, or you have to go through those barriers. You have to say, okay, Mr. Producer, on the publisher side, here's an issue we have about the marketing. Producer then has to take that to their boss, and then to their boss, and then it has to filter down to the marketing team from the boss's boss, and then it has to, be approved by the boss's boss, and then they have to send it to you to approve too. And all of this is just, this bureaucracy of game development that is just wasting time compared to a indie developer or something that could just be like, oh yeah, by the way, here's my personal Twitter, I fixed this mistake. Or they can just make a YouTube video that fixes it, or whatever. Fix the Steam page themselves within a matter of 5 minutes. Easily done. I'm sorry, Tim, I got off track. What were you saying?
Not attracting the people who would want to play your game.
Yeah.
Also, they may not be placed in the right place. They may be put on sites where people who want to play
Facebook ads for Call of Duty. Do you think the people that play Call of Duty are on Facebook? Really? No.
Game don't tend to go to those sites, so it's a demographic thing. You basically miss the demographic.
Yep, wasted
All
money.
this boils down to discoverability, which I have a whole video about, and I'll link it below. And discoverability is becoming harder and harder as more games come out.
Yep,
it is just, the market has so many games that finding your game is becoming harder and harder, which is making marketing more and more important. And I know a lot of people don't like that, but what do you do in a world where 25,000 games come out a year?
I would even bet that it's more than 25, but I mean, maybe he's got the info on that. But to me, it feels like when I look at Steam and all the games releasing in like the next week, it just feels like there's got to be more than 25,000 coming out. Especially if you include like itch.io and stuff, right? Which I'm not. I think that Steam is pretty good at curating. It's very harsh. It's a very harsh algorithm, I'll tell you that. If you do not have a minimum amount of visibility on Steam, Steam doesn't give a shit about you. They really don't. And that sucks for indie developers. But as a gamer, I do feel that Steam is probably one of the best curated storefronts for digital game content that I've seen. Maybe beat out by some of the console markets, but getting your game to console is already a lot harder than getting your game on Steam. So for the ease of access that Steam provides to put your game up for other people, I do think Steam is curated quite well, but it is extremely harsh, and if you do not have that visibility, you're done. It's over.
Hard to find your game among 25,000. So, those are the game and non-game reasons, the biggest ones that I can think of. Now you have to figure it out. Your game is shipped, and you want to figure out why didn't it sell. Well, which of these apply to your game? Lots of people will give you different reasons. And remember, I've talked about how failure is an orphan. when your game doesn't sell, there'll be a lot of finger pointing. People go, you didn't implement it right, and
Yep.
your design was horrible, and marketing sucked, and all
Well,
this.
the finger pointing can go the other way too. I've seen developers just blame players, or they blame like, oh, piracy or something, or third party key resellers, which to some extent, yeah, these all have an impact. I think key resellers do have some impact too, but one that I saw was was actually related to alchemy. I'm not going to name it, but some girl made a pretty good game for alchemy. She spent like 10 years on it. I'm sorry, but do you know how much it takes, even if you're a solo developer, to fund yourself for 10 years? If you and she complained that some EA games released at the same time and pushed her out of existence. Okay, sure. Why weren't you prepared with your marketing more? I'm sorry to say it, but it's like if you didn't have the wish list there to stay on the new and trending page, whose fault is this? I mean, maybe you could have allied yourself with a publisher to help push your sales up more, to help get the word out. At some point, yes, you can say that it was just bad luck, but I don't think it's worth pointing fingers at some, random occurrence and saying, this is the reason my game sold well or sold poorly. If your game had enough wish lists and had enough interest before you went to market, you would have had more visibility. That's how the algorithm works. As I said, it's harsh, but I think it's relatively fair. If you want more visibility, you do marketing. You have a Kickstarter, right? Kickstarter is a good way to, even if your game is finished, just to get a little bit of extra money or put out some physical goods or sell the game at a slightly cheaper price. It's a great way to create some marketing hype to be part of that algorithm and get views from there and convert over to Steam wishlists or over to Steam purchases. Use Steam Next Fest to your advantage. I think at that time when this game had come out, Steam Next Fest was the thing. Go to Steam Next Fest, release your demo. There are multiple ways to market your game, and I don't think it's worth saying, yeah, I spent the last 10 years working on my dream game, and it's finally released, but I did zero marketing. Why didn't it sell well? Surprised Pikachu face. What did you expect, right? It's I hate to say it, but indie developers, I swear you cannot do everything yourself. If you're good at making your game, you might not be good at marketing. If you're good at marketing, you might not be good at making your game. Maybe you're good at both. Maybe you're bad at both. But whatever it is, you need to figure out exactly what you're not good at and then find a way to augment that. And marketing your game is as important as making your game. And you can make the best game in the world, and if you market it poorly, you will sell poorly too. It's just how it comes down. Unless your game is super viral, which again you cannot bank on. You cannot live off of virality.
It's going to be hard to tell, and people will not agree on this. But even if you can get them to agree, there's usually multiple reasons, and they disagree on the weighting. Like, yeah, I agree the design wasn't that good, but you guys, your implementation, I mean, it crashed a lot. That was probably why most people were put off from the game. So
I think
even
it's
if you can get people to
multivariate.
agree on the reasons, they won't agree on the weighting
Multiple
or the
factors.
priority of those reasons. It's really hard to be objective about it too. You're not going to want to blame yourself.
Yep.
Or publishers aren't going to want to blame themselves. It wasn't our marketing. Players aren't going to say, "Oh yeah, I bought a game and I just wasn't into it." Nope, it's a bad game. Even though I think everybody who liked it is a stupid idiot paid shill because I
Oh, it's so true, Tim. I do wish the gamers could be a little bit more objective about things like that. Where, I played Path of Exile 2, right? I'm a big PoE. I love Path of Exile 1. I love it. I've played thousands of hours of Path of Exile 1. I played Path of Exile 2. I didn't really like it that much. I just didn't think it was that great. It didn't fulfill the necessities that I was looking for and expecting in Path of Exile 1. I don't think it's a horrible game. I don't think the people that play it are disliking it, or liking it because of some, they spent money, that therefore they must feel like they like it. It's just that game was not for me. It just did not fulfill the needs that I wanted, and I preferred Path of Exile 1. I can admit that. I don't think people are paid shills over it, but a lot of gamers do think that. They think, how can you like this game? Well, it's like, well, maybe because the reasons that I'm playing it are, I can still enjoy it. I enjoyed Starfield for what it was, which wasn't much, but I could still play it. I still beat it. The DLC was pretty decent in terms of story. Was it the greatest Bethesda game? No. Was it the worst? Maybe. But it wasn't, a 0 out of 10 game. It was just, it was okay. But people would call me a page shill. They'd send me all the Jester emotes on Steam for my review. Whatever. It is what it is.
I didn't like it. It must be a bad game. It's just so hard to come up with an objective reason.
Mm-hmm.
So you're going to hear a lot of things, and a lot of them are going to be subjective. You're going to have to try to tease out the objective reasons your game didn't sell and try to assign weights to them, because you have to do your best at this stage. Don't get discouraged. Try to figure it out. If I had gotten discouraged from a bad game or even negative advice, there'd be no Fallout. There would be no Troika and any of those games. I would have left the industry after making Grand Slam Bridge.
This is true. It's like you either Grand Slam Bridge. I need to see what that game is. Either way, he's right. It's like you need to learn from your failures. If you want to stay in the game industry, I promise you, it's not going to treat you well. You're going to have a lot of negative stuff coming at you from all directions, whether it be from other developers, from publishers, from from shareholders, from gamers. I'm not trying to call gamers toxic or anything, but it's like there's a very loud minority with a lot of games that can really get under the skin of people in a public sphere. It happens with streamers too, YouTubers, whatever. Once you're in the public sphere like that, customers have a right to be upset if they don't like something. That is their right. But as a developer, you cannot let that get under your skin if you intend to stay in the industry for any period of time. You have to learn from your failures. You have to learn from your mistakes. Sometimes you fucked up. In Train Life, I fucked up. I designed what I thought players would enjoy with train signals. I thought that I was in the right with the design. Clearly, the players thought differently. That is a mistake I made. That is something that we should have communicated sooner. That's also why I like early access a lot. It's because you can communicate those sooner, and you might be able to make changes to some of those aspects of the game before the game is fully finished. We didn't do that, and we didn't have the time to fix it, and that was one of the biggest points of contention when it came to the design of that game, was the signaling. It wasn't great. That was my bad. So, that's just one of those things that you need to learn from.
Grand Slam Bridge, which I didn't even get credits on. I should have just gone, oh, I'm done. So I'm just saying, do your best. Learn from the game when it doesn't sell. Mm-hmm. Try to focus on what reviews are saying, what people are saying, when it's constructive. If they just go, it's bad, just go, okay, and move on.
By the way, with that train game, there were a lot of things that players said were wrong. The problem is that a lot of players blindly support developers. They say, oh, game bad, game had publisher, therefore publisher bad. I disagree. As a developer, I disagree. I think that there are a lot of problems and mistakes that are made by the developers that screw over your game. There are times where the developers push back against, the developers push back against the publishers, and then that thing is actually a bad thing to push back on, and the game is worse for it. I understand that from a gamer's point of view, they don't know who to point the finger at. I understand this, but I don't like to that, with the development studio, I know that with the train game, we had a lot of people in the development team point fingers at the publisher and say that's why the game was bad. It wasn't all their fault. Honestly, it wasn't all their fault. And the deeper that I got into discussions with the publishers, I realized that they did some things wrong, but we did some things wrong too. We absolutely did. And it was kind of a joint effort of a financial failure, of an okay game that was half-baked and had some cool things, had some stupid things, and ultimately failed. That's really what it came down to.
When people are saying, oh, I didn't like how this feature worked, or I wish it had had this feature, which a lot of other games in this genre have, focus on those. And then, for the ones you can control, try to do better next time. There will be some you can't control. Maybe you can't control your marketing department. Maybe you weren't in control of deciding the setting of the game.
Yep.
Pick the ones you can control, try to figure out what you can do better on the next game, and make a next game. If you get discouraged early, like I said, 44 years and counting.
It's not the industry for you.
There were many times people said, your games were terrible, you should stop. you wouldn't have had a lot of the games that came subsequently. And I guarantee there's people out there who like some of the ones that came out subsequently. So I'm begging you, if you make a game that doesn't sell, treat it as a learning experience. Try to figure out why it didn't sell,
Yep.
what you can control, and what you can do better next time.
True.
And I guarantee you're going to have a hit eventually.
He's right. Yeah. Very good video from Tim. I completely agree with that. Like he said, just treat it as a learning experience. Do better the next time. Know where you failed and admit where you failed. I think that people will also just look at you and realize if you are, somebody who touts that you are trying to control your ego and that you can control it well, really just be open about the failures that you make. It's just say, I fucked up. I messed up. Can we fix it? Not enough time. Okay, let's learn for the sequel. Let's make it better. Well, this was a great video. So thank you for watching this one. And if you're watching on YouTube, I will catch you on the next one. Bye, YouTube.